Tantra Illuminated with Dr. Christopher Wallace is a journey through the depths of the human experience, as viewed through the lens of the tradition called non-dual Shaiva Tantra. This multi-format podcast delves into the fascinating world of classical Tantra and its intersections with philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, human development, and the broader world of spirituality. Today's episode is an archival episode. That is an interview with me recorded some years ago, and we'll be doing a few more of these archival episodes in the future, so that eventually all the interviews I've ever done are all compiled in one place right here on this podcast. So this interview is from about 7 years ago, and I'm being interviewed by a friend of mine, Ashton Szabo, who's a really great guy, a great yogi from California, now living in Bali, and a very enthusiastic guy and a sweet man. And Ashton is now the head, or one of the heads, of the Alchemy Yoga Center near Ubud in Bali. And I have taught there, and it is a wonderful place. So I recommend it if you visit Bali. So 7 years ago, Ashton was hosting a podcast, which is now defunct. And he did this interview with me right before my second book came out, the Recognition Sutras. So this is just a couple months before that book came out. And so we're talking about that topic, the Heart of Recognition teachings, also known as the Recognition Sutras, or Pratyabhijñāhṛdaya in Sanskrit. So this is a nice, short, fun interview, a little blast from the past. Hope you enjoy it. I started practicing meditation, and I still, I actually remember with kind of vivid clarity when I was about 17 and I was in the sort of lobby area of this meditation center I went to, and someone showed me a copy of this Indian book with the title Pratyabhijñāhṛdaya on the cover, a very forbiddingly long word, but it sort of captivated me somehow. For some reason, there was some kind of resonance. There's no logical reason for that. It was just this Indian book with some sculpture on the cover and this long Sanskrit word. And but I felt like there was something there. And over the years, I kind of got familiar with it a little bit in this antiquated mid-20th century Indian English translation by Jaidev Singh, which is not really all that comprehensible except in bits. So finally, after some years of practice, I decided to kind of study this tradition full time, meaning the Asian spiritual traditions, especially South Asian, especially Indian, especially Hindu, and especially Kashmir Shaivism, as it's sometimes called. That's actually a misnomer, because this Shaiva Tantric tradition was indeed pan-Indian and actually pan-Asian. It's just that its most famous authors and exponents happen to have lived in the Kashmir Valley. But Kashmir Shaivism makes it sound like it was a regional phenomenon, when actually it was a very widespread tradition. So, but some of its most impressive kind of spiritual philosophical works originated from the Kashmir Valley, far to the north of India, including this one. The Pratyabhijñāhṛdaya literally means the essence of the teachings on recognition, or the heart of the teachings on recognition. And recognition here means recognition of your true nature, recognition of yourself as God, basically, recognition of your innate being as an instantiation of divine consciousness and totally non-different from the divine consciousness which underlies, supports, creates, sustains, and dissolves the whole universe. So that's the recognition in question. That it's the culmination of a lineage. Actually, this particular text, there's a whole recognition lineage with about 4 or 5 famous exponents. And this particular text is sort of the crown jewel of that lineage. It's not the longest, it's not the most thorough, but it is the most spiritually powerful. It's the most succinct and concise, for sure. That's why he called it the Hridaya, the heart or essence of the Pratyabhijñā, the recognition teachings.
And can we talk about that first, a quick moment, in the sense of the scope of the Pratyabhijñā tradition and lineage itself within the scope of the tantric traditions? Like, where does it fit, or how does it contrast some of the other beliefs through the various lineages that are around at the time?
Well, okay, so that's a bit of a complex question. In terms of the practice lineage that it's a part of, it's most closely related to the Trika lineage, but is also the Krama, and those are lineage-based practice traditions. But it contrasts, I would say, with other stuff that was going on at the time, in that it is so rigorously worked out on the intellectual level as well as the practice level. So, in other words, Shaiva Tantra, like other forms of Tantra, is primarily focused on practice and, yoga and daily observance and so forth. And, Tantra is primarily not an intellectual philosophical tradition. So what happened here in the recognition lineage is that these authors wanted to defend the non-dual view against Buddhist philosophical opponents and other philosophical opponents that were around in India at the time. And they wanted to make the non-dual view kind of viable on every level, not only the practical experiential level, which was already there, but the intellectual philosophical level as well. They wanted to produce a series of works, and they did produce a series of works that would completely convince the mind of a reflective individual that non-duality is not some mystical, airy-fairy, wishful thinking, but in fact is the most sensical view to have on reality, you might say. So the irony is that in the modern period, a lot of these philosophical works survive and have been more widely read than the practical works, such that a lot of people who've heard of Kashmir Shaivism think of it as a very sophisticated, esoteric, intellectual, spiritual philosophy, when in fact most of the tradition was very, very, very practical, and that this kind of esoteric branch is the exception rather than the rule. Having said that, it was very influential, and indeed phrases and sutras from the Pratyabhijñāhṛdaya, from this text we're talking about, appear in other works subsequently, including even scriptures. So it's very unusual for scriptures supposedly authored by God or by deities to quote a work by a human author. And that shows how influential it was. Lines from it appear in the Lakshmi Tantra, for example, and in the Yogini Hridaya, as well as many other works.
Before we jump into the text itself, maybe we could give people a little context with the author Kshemarāja and his teacher Sri Abhinavagupta, because to me they kind of represent the pinnacle. And again, I'm no scholar, but just from my experience with the material, that like these two really represent a time within these traditions where, I mean, you've got a master like Abhinavagupta, his student is Kshemarāja, and it just, you see this flowering of these ideas, both on kind of, as you mentioned, the logical side, but there's also a lot of ecstasy at the time, a lot of poetry, a lot of real beauty coming out of the tradition. Can you explain a little bit of just the context of that?
Yeah, and if we just go back a tiny bit in the lineage, there's this fellow Utpaladeva who is considered sort of the grand master of the recognition philosophy. And what's interesting is that he exhibits both of these, both sides of things that you were just referring to, the ecstatic, the emotional, the devotional on the one hand, and the rigorously logical, philosophical, and rational on the other hand. And Utpaladeva exhibits these in different works. He doesn't combine them in the same work. So when he writes on recognition philosophy, he's one of the most advanced and sophisticated intellects in Indian history. And then when he writes devotional poetry, he's absolutely overflowing with such effusive emotion and rapture and ecstasy and the whole range of emotions, actually, not just ecstatic emotions, come through in his devotional poetry. And he keeps those separate in his literary output. And so what's interesting is that when we come to Abhinavagupta, 2 generations later, Abhinavagupta is starting to combine these in the sense that he can weave back and forth from logical, rational argument, such as in the Tantra Loka, and then in other passages sort of get incredibly poetic and beautiful. And not keeping them separate, where the ecstatic poetry has an element of kind of philosophical rigor as well, and so they're woven together more closely. They're not compartmentalized as they are for Utpala. And then the same phenomenon again in his disciple Kshemarāja, Abhinavagupta's primary disciple and successor. Kshemarāja, who wrote the Pratyabhijñāhṛdaya that we're discussing here, also will kind of combine both elements. He will kind of little threads of carefully worked out, thoughtful argumentation of the nature of reality, along with very, very, very poetic passages. So I try to bring that out in my translation as well. I'm sure someone who reads the book will notice that sometimes it's really challenging to their mind, and other times it's really, kind of heart-openingly beautiful and poetic, and that's intentional. And I think in our modern culture, that we don't always. I think it can be hard for modern readers actually to move back and forth. They expect a work to be one or the other. And so I think it's a wonderful kind of experience to be in that dance with the author.
And something really important to mention that I didn't mention in your introduction is that you're actually publishing a book on this amazing text called the Recognition Sutras. And so that's, I imagine that it's difficult having such the breadth and the space to expand on all the amazing knowledge in here. If we were to refine or take all of the content and simplify it for our listeners to say, like, what at the heart is this text really about? Could you find a way to say it that especially for the people that maybe they're just the average yogi of like, okay, well, I've heard of these yoga sutras before from that Patanjali guy. Like, why, not only what is it about, but why would the average yogi or meditation practitioner benefit from this text?
Yeah, so modern yoga, in modern yoga, both in the sort of meditative sphere and the physical asana sphere, we have what scholars regard as a fairly kind of incoherent mishmash of dualistic and non-dualistic philosophies. So dualistic philosophies of whether non-theistic or semi-theistic, like Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, or dualistic philosophies that are strongly theistic, like the Hare Krishna movement, kind of those spheres of influence mixed up with non-dual teachings in a more or less incoherent way, meaning to say that a lot of modern yoga practitioners will sort of quote non-dualist ideas like God dwells within the heart of every human being, at the same time as kind of advocating dualistic practices like renunciation or kind of puritanical attitudes towards certain behaviors. So I think part of the growth of the contemporary yoga movement is the move towards greater coherency, because in the late 20th century, we certainly had a lot of vague, ambiguous, nice sounding teachings that weren't really thoroughly understood and that were coexisting in this way with contradictory teachings. And now we're moving towards greater coherence as we have more and more scholar practitioners out there working and publishing and writing blogs and so on. And I'm one of those. We didn't actually explicitly say so yet, but my PhD is in Sanskrit, so this book is based on a lot of work in the primary sources, not just in this particular text, because the author quotes a lot of other sources as well. So actually to translate this, you have to be familiar with a whole range of sources. But to come back to your main point, I think it's really powerful and useful for people to see where which teachings come from and which view they actually resonate with, and to gain kind of coherence and clarity to their spiritual perspective. And so that's part of what Tantra Illuminated was trying to do, to illustrate all the teachings that people have heard of, as well as some they hadn't heard of, that come from non-dual Tantra, So this particular book, Kshemarāja, actually, he's encompassing the recognition philosophy. That's, as we said, the title. He's summing it up and giving its essence, its pith, its marrow. But the thing is, he's actually doing something more that he's too sort of humble to actually say up front. He is summarizing the whole of the non-dual tantric path in his 50-page work in the original Sanskrit. Because what he ends up doing is he weaves in teachings from the Spanda lineage, from the Krama lineage, from a bunch of different lineages that formed like the key pieces of the puzzle for a non-dual tantric practitioner. And maybe he didn't even intend to do this when he first set pen to paper, but he ends up describing and encapsulating the whole of the spiritual path from a non-dual tantric perspective. So he describes, part of the main arc of the book, I would say, is he describes how divine consciousness, infinite, all-encompassing, singular divine consciousness, internally differentiates and becomes all the different conscious beings that exist in the universe and all the objects of their experience. And how that is an act of sort of self-concealment in plurality. That is to say, the singular divine consciousness forgets, to a certain extent, its true nature in this act of expressing itself in this kind of infinite diversity. And in that self-forgetfulness enters into identification with its various forms and experiences suffering when there is, in this act of self-forgetting, there's suffering because there, the one with a sort of capital O, the one experiences sort of alienation from itself, even though it's actually never separate from itself, right? Insofar as you, let's take the specific example, insofar as you, the listener, believe that you are so-and-so, believe that you are a separate self, even though you're never anything but the one, you experience a kind of alienation and the angst that all human beings experience, whether they cover it up or numb it out. All human beings in their life experience this angst and this wondering, what the hell is it all about? And this angst is said to be the natural condition of the one when it has forgotten that it is the one and believes that it is merely Ashton or fill in the blank. So that whole arc is described in the first half of the book, and then the second half of the book, the arc of returning to remembrance is described. Okay, so the process by which consciousness wakes up to itself, realizes its true nature. And I think it's very key to acknowledge here that 1,000 years ago, Kshemarāja was already very aware of what Ken Wilber called the pre-trans fallacy, meaning to say that the arc of spiritual realization is not simply a return to the original state of undifferentiation, because if that's all it was, why would the one bother to engage in this creative expression differentiation in the first place? In fact, no, the spiritual process of self-realization is not simply a return. It is a reconciliation, if you will. That is to say, the one realizes its oneness in the midst of diversity, not by dissolving it, but by realizing that all the diverse expressions are diverse expressions of the one. And even that is a simplistic way of saying it, but we're just trying to here kind of just really sum it up.
Yeah, and I mean simplistic, but also very significant when it's contrasted against the kind of philosophy that often's packaged with yoga in the West, which is that it's about dissolution of all this to get to that point that's nothing like our experience that we're having now, which so often leads to yoga practitioners caught up in that. Well, I'm doing yoga, but I can't really experience anything until I give up all my possessions, or I stop eating meat, or I go to India, or there's always that further thing that needs to happen when, as you said, this is about recognizing who you are within the experience, because the suffering comes not from being in it, it's from forgetting who you are. And I think that's such a powerful shift especially for the modern yoga practitioner, to realize that this is it. It just becomes a matter of not only remembering, but integrating that understanding into your everyday life.
Yes. That's absolutely crucial. And to give a name to it, the non-dual tantric tradition is anti-transcendentalist. Then let me explain that term, because it doesn't mean that they're opposed to having transcendental experiences. They're absolutely not. But in terms of the arc of the spiritual path, it's not aimed at a kind of permanent transcendence of the conditions of embodiment. Quite the opposite. It's aimed at a realization of the transcendent within the conditions of embodiment, within the messy human life, within the ordinary mundane details of an everyday existence. And they're very explicit about that, which is wonderful. And that's precisely the main tension that I was talking about in the incoherence of modern yoga, is to put a more precise language to it, is this transcendentalist impulse of somehow getting beyond the conditions of life, which is to be rejected as inherently flawed. That existing in tension with the idea that the divine is everywhere and within everything. And I think that incoherence is very apparent in many modern yoga practitioners, whether they regard our political system as just inherently screwed, our environment is inherently screwed, as our capitalist consumerist society is inherently screwed, and all of that is used as a kind of excuse for why transcendental transcendentalism is the way to go. Up and out, escape, and stay gone. And that was Patanjali's view. Not a lot of people know that it was, but it was. And this is a different view where the transcendental is to be realized in the everyday. And Kshemarāja says this halfway, no less, a third of the way through the book. He says, some people teach that the divine is wholly transcendent, beyond, above and beyond this world. Other people teach that the divine is this world, is nature, and it's nothing more than nature. That's the pantheist view, right? And Kshemarāja says this very crucial thing. He says, our lineage is defined by the teaching that the divine is simultaneously transcendent and immanent, meaning it's always more than meets the eye, and yet it's everything the eye can meet. That divine consciousness is always more than meets the eye or ear or whatever, but yet it's everything the eye can meet. So it's the whole of manifest reality, and yet it's something beyond what the senses can contact as well. It's simultaneously transcendent and immanent, and to realize that is the goal of the non-dual tantric path.
Now, for someone that maybe is hearing some of this stuff for the very first time, and they're hearing, okay, well, I hear you saying right now that it's all divine. Everything that I see is divine, meaning the horrors of the world, some of those other things that you spoke of that lead often to that transcendental type of thinking. Where do we go? Like, how do we deal with that? How do we deal with that? Like, well, okay, I'm seeing this issue now of something that my mind views as horrific, and someone's telling me, well, that should be okay. Is it saying that it's okay, or how is this? How can we use this and still integrate it into a world that we say now we're going to choose the type of world we're going to live in without perhaps the moral side? Well, it's divine that this is good or this is bad. Like, how do we reconcile that issue living in the world if it's all divine?
Well, I think you've actually asked pretty much the deepest question that a person can possibly ask of any spiritual philosophy, and especially this one. And it's a question that was very carefully not only thought through, but felt through by the masters of this tradition. Now, to sum up their answer to that question briefly is challenging, but I'm going to try. First of all, the mind, the conditioned thinking mind, the mind, the inner commentator, the mind that we use to think to ourselves with, is not capable of embracing the whole nature of reality. What it does is it carves up reality into chunks and abstracts those chunks, So the mind will look at one thing at a time, so it'll look at some horrible thing and be horrified by it, and say, wait, how could this be part of, this divine consciousness? How could this be a perfect expression of God or of divine awareness? But the reason that it struggles with that is because it's constantly taking things out of context. It's constantly carving something out and abstracting it and looking at it sort of apart. And what we do in the spiritual practice in this tradition, and in many others I know too, is we seek to soften out of that compulsive tendency of the mind to grab onto this or that, and almost always sort of one thing at a time that it obsesses with. And when the distortive, we seek to also antidote the distortive tendency of the mind, right? Because if the mind is holding onto a story like the world is going to pot, the world's going to shit or whatever, then it's going to, by the problem of confirmation bias, it's going to see all the evidence that seems to confirm its story. And there's going to be a distortive magnification of all the problems in the world, and a kind of amazing ability to overlook the countless moments of beauty and love that are happening everywhere in the world, even in war zones. So how the thing is, you cannot struggle with the mind to make it grasp the whole spectrum of reality. It just can't do it. It can't, you know. And for that, by that token, of course, there's other people who are just focus on, they kind of deny the painful aspect of reality and only focus on the positive, and they kind of magnify that. Their mind sees onto that, and they push away the painful and focus on the positive, and that's detrimental too in other ways. So here we're talking about letting go of that mental tendency to try to tell a story about the nature of reality, and softening into this open space of awareness that makes room for everything. And if we succeed in doing that, what we discover is that this world is a play of consciousness, and that consciousness is infinitely free, and in its freedom, it expresses the full range of possibilities always. That's clearly what consciousness does and wants to do, because that's what's always happening in reality, is the full range of possibilities is expressed. Now, if we just then, again, zero in on one end of the range, say that's horrible. But you see, there's a beauty, there's an inexpressible beauty that can't be explained or rationalized in the expression of the whole range of possibilities. That consciousness, in some sense, we could say, it says yes to all the possibilities latent or inherent within its being. It doesn't deny any aspect of itself. It says yes to the possibility of ignorance and pain and cruelty. It says yes to the possibility of beauty and joy and realization and connection. It says yes to everything. If you just look at the nature of reality, we live in a universe where consciousness has said yes to the whole range of possibilities. And ultimately, it's like you can struggle against that, or you can say, fuck, that's beautiful in a way. You know, it's horrifyingly beautiful sometimes, and it's gloriously beautiful sometimes, but it's just this intensity of willingness to experience the full range of possibilities inherent within its being. And that's why in the tantric tradition, we have these wrathful, frightening deities, and we have these incredibly beautiful, benevolent deities, and they equally represent aspects of the divine. The wrathful deities are showing us that in the challenging, in the horrifying, there's as much opportunity for realization of the nature of reality as in the lovely and beautiful, you know.
Would you say that this is kind of the importance of practice then, that we're not trying to get this purely from an intellectual side because of what you were talking about with the mind and its inability to really coalesce all of it together, and it wants to separate it all. So we need practices to really help us to, I don't know if go beyond the mind would be the right way to phrase it, but to sort of bypass that tendency of the mind to always separate, so that we could reintegrate back into the mind?
Yeah, absolutely. I think only with practice can you have this experience of sort of softening out of, it's an opening out of and softening out of fixation on the thoughts and feelings generated by the conditioned mind, and into this wider spectrum where actually the mind doesn't even need to be bypassed. It's just a part of this much wider spectrum of awareness. The mind is a functional capacity within awareness, and it's not really all that significant. It's certainly not as significant as it thinks it is, but it's just a functional capacity. It's part of what's going on within awareness, and awareness is this incredibly open, spacious field of presence, which is willing to sort of accommodate whatever arises and let go of whatever subsides. Meaning, you know, in the tradition, the awareness itself is worshipped as a goddess, as the divine mother, because like a mother just loves all of her children, you know, whether they're, you know, whether one has a high IQ, whether another is, you know, mentally challenged or whatever, a mother loves all of her children, you know. And in the same way, awareness is open to all the phenomena of experience, meaning to say, awareness doesn't exclude anything from arising within awareness. The mind might resist it and say, oh, I don't like that. But awareness makes equal space for all phenomena that arise and subside. So that metaphor may or may not work for any given listener.
So going back to the text for a moment, do you have a favorite verse within the text?
Well, there's just so many. There's so many gems.
It's like asking for your favorite child again. And go back to what you were just saying, I guess.
Yeah, there's so many gems, and a big part. When I described the arc of the text earlier, I was only describing sort of the main project, but there's a lot of sub-projects within that. And one of his main sub-projects in the text is to show how the 5 acts of God, so-called, within the earlier tradition are actually instantiated within the consciousness of each and every human being. And so that's a really, he has a couple of sutras on this, how all we're doing all the time is performing these 5 acts that are attributed to Shiva in the earlier tradition, the acts of creation, sustenance, dissolution, concealment, and revelation. But that's all that we are doing ourselves all the time. In other words, he spends quite a bit of time talking about how consciousness, even on the individuated level, even on the level of someone who has 0 spiritual awakening as of yet, that person is still doing the same thing. They're still creating the world of their experience, sustaining it, eventually dissolving it, whether it's by changing their paradigm or by leaving the body, concealing the fact to themselves that they are the creator, sustainer, and dissolver of their experience of reality, and then eventually revealing that fact to themselves as well. So there's this wonderful argument in the text, which I think is applicable to anyone, whether they've had a spiritual awakening or not, that through a variety of kind of subtle mechanisms, they are creating their experience of reality moment to moment. And notice that I'm using the word experience there. So it's not the same as this kind of New Age teaching, you create your own reality. It's rather the more subtle and I think more accurate, you create your experience of reality. So, and that there's there's a vast range of possible ways that you can experience any given reality. So humans, culturally conditioned humans, which is almost everyone, tends to assume that the conditions of their external reality dictate their inner state or their range of possible responses. If good things happen, or what they consider good things, they're going to be happy. If bad things happen, they're going to be miserable. They're sort of, the standard human view is to consider oneself, not even consciously, but to consider oneself a victim of circumstance, of what life chooses to do, of luck or fate. And this is precisely the opposite view. It's seeking to educate the reader or the contemplative that that there's a vast range of possible experiences you can have of any given reality, that the external circumstances do not dictate your internal state, and that you create your experience of reality moment to moment, whether it's through the samskaras or impressions of your past and knee-jerk reactions to your own conditioning, or whether it's through a contemplative life and awareness cultivation, whether you're doing it in ignorant mode or whether you're doing it in a self-aware mode, everyone is creating their experience of reality moment to moment and sustaining it, and sooner or later dissolving it and creating a different way of experiencing reality. And that's happening on the micro level, and it's happening on the macro level within a human life. So that itself is one of the most fascinating bits. And the two sort of main sutras about that are 10 and 11. And I've just done a couple of blog posts about those very sutras. So if the listener wants to learn more about what I'm talking about, they can read those recent blog posts, How to Know That You Are God and The Most Intimate Part of You.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today to talk about this text and just talk about the traditions as a whole. I really appreciate the work that you're doing out there in the community. I hope people, I know that I've actually gone to your Indiegogo campaign. I've contributed already. I hope our listeners go and do the same so that we can help to continue to bring these really rich, amazing texts out into the world, especially for our contemporary yoga community, to actually get more than what we've had access to for ever since kind of yoga has been exposed to us here in the West. It's really nice to get more and more of the authentic traditions and the subtleties of some of the differences out to us so that we can continue to evolve the way that we engage the practice here in the West. So thank you again for doing that.
And let me just add briefly that, a lot of people sort of unconsciously assume that the main kind of classics of yoga that have come down to us must be the best and most important ones. And really, actually, history doesn't work that way. There's so many factors. And, the texts that have come down to us and that happen to be famous now, like the Yoga Sutra, scholars sometimes call it a historical accident, that this is considered one of the most important texts of the tradition. And I think as more and more translations come out, such as the Recognition Sutras is just one among many, people will start to see that, wow, actually there's material they didn't even know about that matches their intuitive view of the nature of reality through their meditative and yogic experience more than what they've previously been exposed to. So I really hope and think it's possible that works like the Recognition Sutras in another generation or two will be kind of given the pride of place that they deserve on their own merits. I'm not saying my translation is the final and ultimate word on the matter. I hope even better translations will come and in the next generation of this work and of others like it, because there's so much golden material which has not even reached the yoga public, let alone the general public as of yet. We're actually just at the beginning of this kind of revelation of the treasure trove of the teachings in the original sources.
And I'll totally second that. I mean, I grew up around the Yoga Sutras and other philosophy. I grew up a lot in Taoism and stuff, but I was being drawn because of what I had access to this sort of ascetic lifestyle. When I was exposed to Tantra, it really kind of demanded my attention because it was actually falling in line. It was providing a map that actually fit my experience, where the Yoga Sutras simply weren't. They weren't falling in line with the experiences that I was having. So it just as you said, like we're starting to get these texts come out that really help to mirror, just like I imagine it did in the original traditions, where, if you look at the dates of something like Patanjali's Yoga Sutras and then how the practice and the understandings evolve through hundreds of years, you really see the sophistication continue to be drawn out of that. And I really appreciate that, and appreciate that these texts are coming now, especially to the Western world.
Oh, and a quick point on that is that not to say that the Yoga Sutras aren't important. They're one among many, many important works.
Absolutely.
And actually, I just recently, for those who are interested in this particular topic, I just very recently did a blog on Patanjali's Yoga Sutra and how the Ashtanga Yoga, the 8-part yoga taught in chapter 2 of Patanjali, is adopted by one of the tantric texts and radically reinterpreted in a non-dual mode. And I give previously unpublished translations of that in one of my most recent blogs.
Awesome. Well, I hope our listeners go and check out your blogs, check out your courses, contribute to the campaign. You got a lot of different stuff going on, and it's really helping to push our community forward. So thank you for that. For all of our listeners, For all of our listeners out there today, thank you so much for listening. I'm sure that you've learned a lot. I know that I have. I really appreciate when scholars and practitioners such as Harish come onto the show and get to share their knowledge and understanding with us. I hope you all have a wonderfully present moment. Namaste.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. Remember, you can always find out more about the tradition of non-dual Shaiva Tantra at tantrailluminated.org, where, if you wish, you can become a subscriber to our online learning portal, and you'll receive access to a vast number of recordings, including a comprehensive curriculum in tantric philosophy, tantric yoga, guided meditation, and much, much more. Music for the podcast composed and recorded by Ann Leader. Find her at annleader.com. Podcast produced by Grazia Tribulato. New episodes drop every week, and may all beings benefit.